Every country on Earth is drowning, not in water, but in red ink. The United States currently shoulders a burden of over $38 trillion. Japan is crushed under $9 trillion. If you aggregate every ledger, every treasury bond, and every promissory note, the entire planet owes $315 trillion. That is 3 times the size of the entire global economy. It is a number so large it ceases to be mathematics and becomes theology. But here is the paradox that should keep you awake at night. If every nation is in debt, if the sum of all debt is greater than the sum of all value, who exactly is owed? Logic suggests that for every debtor, there must be a creditor. If the world is in the red, who is in the black? The answer isn't what you think. It isn't a foreign power. It isn't a hidden civilization. When you follow the chain of creditors, when you strip away the bureaucratic euphemisms and track who actually holds the paper, you discover something disturbing. The world effectively owes money to itself. Or rather, the productive population of the world owes a permanent tithe to a financial mechanism that sits above nations. This is not an accident. It is not a glitch in capitalism. 4 men, 4 bankers across 3 different centuries, designed it this way. Deliberately. They were not merely financiers, they were architects of a new form of reality. They built a system where debt can never be repaid, where governments are forced to borrow until the end of time, where interest flows eternally upward like a river defying gravity, and where the people who designed the trap profit from every payment, every crisis, and every bailout. This isn't a conspiracy theory found on the dark web. This is documented, verified history. The meetings happened. The contracts exist in dusty archives. The mechanisms are public record. But they are written in a language designed to bore you, to make you look away. Once you see how they built it, you will understand why that $38 trillion debt clock isn't a problem the government is trying to solve. It is the system working exactly as designed. Let me introduce you to the 4 architects and the 4 specific moments in history when humanity was quietly walked into a prison without bars. To understand the first lock on the door, we have to travel back to a time when kings, not bankers, ruled the world. And we have to understand why they failed. Before 1694, sovereign debt was a crude, barbaric affair. If a king or queen needed money to wage war or build a palace, they did it the old-fashioned way. They begged or they stole. They would approach wealthy merchants, goldsmiths, or nobles and promise repayment with interest. It was a personal loan. And like all personal loans to powerful people, it was risky. If the king lost the war, he didn't pay. If the king simply decided he didn't want to pay, he defaulted. This was known as the sovereign prerogative. For the lender, it was catastrophic. For the king, it was merely embarrassing. But crucially, the debt was finite. It was either repaid or it was defaulted upon. The system cleared itself. It was messy, but it was honest. William Paterson changed the physics of money. Paterson was a Scottish merchant, a visionary, and a bit of a hustler. He had spent years in the coffeehouses of London watching the English crown struggle. In 1691, he had an idea that would reshape civilization more than the steam engine or the internet. The context was desperate. England was locked in the 9 Years' War with France. King William III was functionally bankrupt. The treasury was empty, the soldiers were unpaid, and traditional lenders were refusing to hand over another shilling because the crown had a history of stiffing its creditors. England was vulnerable. Paterson approached the king's ministers with a seductive proposal. He would organize a syndicate of wealthy merchants to lend the government $1.2 million. In today's purchasing power, that is roughly $500 million. It was enough to save the war effort. But here was the innovation, the poison pill that tasted like candy. Paterson proposed that the loan would never be repaid. The principal, the $1.2 million, would vanish into the government's coffers. In exchange, The government would legally bind itself to pay interest on that money forever, at a rate of 8% annually. To manage this arrangement, Patterson proposed creating a completely new type of institution, the Governor and Company of the Bank of England. The mechanics were revolutionary and terrifyingly brilliant. The wealthy merchants would deposit their gold into the Bank of England. The bank would lend that capital to the king. The king would tax the peasantry and the merchants to pay the 8% interest. The bank would distribute that interest back to the shareholders, but the masterstroke was in the collateral. Why would a merchant give up their gold for a loan that is never paid back? Because the interest payments were guaranteed by Parliament. They were backed not by the king's word, but by the taxing power of the state. As long as there were citizens to tax, the interest would flow. Patterson effectively securitized the future labor of the British people. Furthermore, the lenders received bank notes in exchange for their gold. These receipts could be traded. They became the first modern paper currency. The lenders still had liquidity, they could spend the notes, but they also collected interest. It was alchemy. They had their cake and ate it too. Parliament approved Patterson's scheme in 1694. The Bank of England was chartered. The merchants provided the gold, the king got his war chest, and for the first time in human history, national debt became permanent. It was no longer a temporary bridge to cross a crisis. It was a foundational pillar of the state. Think about the implications. The government paid $96,000 a year in interest on that original loan. Over a century, they would pay that principal back many times over, yet they would still owe the full $1.2 million. The merchants had purchased a permanent annuity on the English economy. Patterson's genius wasn't just in lending money. It was in creating money out of debt. The Bank of England was granted the right to issue notes backed by government debt. The more the government borrowed, the more money the bank could print. This established the template that every nation uses today. Step 1. Government borrows. Step 2. Principal is never repaid. Step 3. Interest is paid forever via taxation. Step 4. The debt itself becomes the currency base. It is brilliant if you are a banker. It is catastrophic if you are a taxpayer. You are essentially paying rent on the currency you use to a private landlord who never fixes the building. Patterson died in 1719. He did not die incredibly wealthy. He was a visionary, not a shark. But the machine he built is immortal. The Bank of England still stands on Threadneedle Street. That original debt from 1694? It has never been paid off. It has been refinanced, rolled over, bundled, and expanded, but it exists. The British people are still paying for William III's war with France. Within 50 years, every major European power looked at England's ability to wage war on credit and copied the model. France, the Netherlands, and eventually the newly independent United States, under Alexander Hamilton, adopted the system. Hamilton explicitly modeled America's financial architecture on Patterson's Bank of England. Permanent debt, interest paid from taxes, bonds traded as currency. But if Patterson built the engine, it was still a local machine. British debt was for the British. French debt was for the French. The markets were fragmented. The trap was set, but the world wasn't yet tied together. Enter the second architect, the man who took this local engine and industrialized it, creating a web so complex that no fly could ever escape. By the early 1800s, European governments were addicted to Patterson's model. They borrowed for everything: wars, palaces, canals. But there was no organized market. If you wanted to buy debt, you had to know the right minister. It was a club. Interest rates varied wildly depending on who you knew. Nathan Rothschild changed that. The Rothschild family began as money changers in the Jewish ghetto of Frankfurt. But by 1800, the patriarch Meyer Amschel Rothschild had sent his 5 sons to the 5 financial capitals of Europe: London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples. This wasn't just a family business, It was the first multinational corporation. They created an information network that was faster than any government courier. A letter could move from Naples to London through the Rothschild network days faster than official diplomatic channels. In the age of sail and horse, information was the ultimate arbitrage. Nathan Rothschild, stationed in London, was the strategic genius of the clan. He looked at the sovereign debt market and saw inefficiency. He decided to industrialize it. During the Napoleonic Wars, Britain was burning through cash. Nathan didn't just lend to the government. He revolutionized the structure of the loan. Instead of a direct contract, he bought government bonds at a wholesale discount and resold them to retail investors at a markup. He created the secondary bond market. Suddenly, government debt wasn't just a contract, it was a product. It was a tradable asset. Nathan sold these bonds to pension funds, insurance companies, and wealthy aristocrats across the continent. The government got its money instantly. Rothschild pocketed the spread. The investors got a piece of paper that paid reliable interest. But here is where the story turns darker. Rothschild didn't just facilitate the market. He realized that by controlling the debt, he could control the outcome of the war and, by extension, the fate of nations. The date was June 18, 1815, the Battle of Waterloo. The fate of Europe hung in the balance. If Napoleon won, the British Empire would crumble. If Wellington won, Britain would rule the century. In London, the financial markets were paralyzed with fear. But Nathan Rothschild wasn't afraid. He was waiting. Legend often dramatizes this moment, but the reality is colder and more calculating than any fiction. Rothschild's private courier network, a system of fast boats and fresh horses, brought him the news of Napoleon's defeat hours, perhaps a full day, before the official British government messengers arrived. He possessed the most valuable commodity in the world, asymmetric information. He didn't rush to the government to share the good news. He went to the stock exchange. With all eyes on him, the most powerful banker in London, he began to sell. He dumped British government bonds aggressively. The floor traders, seeing Rothschild sell, assumed the worst. Napoleon has won. Britain is lost. Panic swept the floor. Everyone sold. Prices crashed to the floor. Then, in the final moments before the official news arrived, Rothschild reversed his position. He bought everything. He scooped up the entire British bond market for pennies on the pound. When the news of Wellington's victory finally broke, prices skyrocketed. Nathan Rothschild didn't just make a profit. He consolidated the debt of the British Empire into his own hands. This moment established the Rothschild model. Control the information, control the issuance, control the market. But his true innovation wasn't the trade itself. It was what came after. By 1820, the Rothschild family had effectively created the first international bond market. Before this, if a king defaulted, it was a local problem. Maybe a few local merchants went bankrupt. Rothschild changed the geometry of risk. He made debt tradable across borders. A British government bond might be owned by a French count who used it as collateral for a loan from a German bank, which was insured by an Austrian fund. Do you see the trap? The web of ownership became so complex, so interconnected, that defaulting on debt was no longer just an act of refusing to pay. It was an act of suicide. If a government defaulted, they wouldn't just anger a banker, they would trigger a cascading collapse of the entire European financial system. Rothschild invented too big to fail nearly 200 years before the 2008 crisis. He made the debt trap inescapable, not by force, but by entanglement. Governments had to pay, and they had to keep borrowing to pay the interest on old debts, because the alternative was systemic oblivion. By the mid-19th century, the Rothschild family was wealthier than any royal dynasty. They didn't build factories. They didn't farm land. They farmed governments. Fast forward to the turn of the 20th century. The center of gravity was shifting. The United States was becoming an industrial titan, forging steel and building railroads. But financially, America was still the Wild West. There was no central bank. The money supply was tied to gold. Banks operated independently, and they failed often. The economy was prone to violent seizures, booms followed by devastating busts. Enter the third architect, J.P. Morgan. Morgan was not just a banker, he was the Jupiter of Wall Street, a man of immense physical presence and terrifying intellect. He understood that for his banking empire to reign supreme, he needed stability. He needed to eliminate the chaotic busts that threatened his wealth. In 1907, a massive financial panic hit New York. The stock market collapsed, trust evaporated, depositors lined up to pull their cash. The system was hours away from total disintegration. Morgan personally intervened. He summoned the city's leading bankers to his private library on Madison Avenue. He locked the doors. He told them they weren't leaving until they pledged their own capital to bail out the failing institutions. He bullied, cajoled, and forced them to save the economy. It worked. The panic of 1907 ended, but Morgan, then 70 years old, realized a chilling truth. I cannot do this again. A modern economy could not rely on the health of one old man to save it. He and his associates, the Rockefeller interests, the Warburgs, the Kuhn-Loebs, decided that America needed a permanent solution. They needed a central bank. But there was a problem. The American public hated central banks. They viewed them as tools of European oppression. If Morgan announced, "I am building a central bank to manage your money," there would have been riots in the streets. So they resorted to a conspiracy. And I use that word in its literal legal definition. A secret plan by a group to do something unlawful or harmful. In November 1910, a private train car left New Jersey under the cover of darkness. On board were Senator Nelson Aldrich, the political voice, Frank Vanderlip, representing the Rockefellers, Paul Warburg, the theoretical architect, and Benjamin Strong, Morgan's lieutenant. Their destination? Jekyll Island, Georgia, an exclusive hunting club for the ultra-wealthy. For 9 days, completely cut off from the world, these men drafted the legislation for what would become the Federal Reserve System. They wrote it in secret because they knew that if the public found out that Wall Street bankers were writing the nation's monetary laws, the bill would die instantly. The genius of the plan was in the branding. The name. They didn't call it a central bank. They called it the Federal Reserve to make it sound governmental and decentralized. The structure. It wouldn't be one bank. It would be 12 regional banks, giving the illusion of local control. The power. It would be overseen by a board in Washington, but the real power, the Open Market Committee, would be dominated by the New York branch, Morgan's branch. They presented it to Congress as a way to limit the power of Wall Street. In reality, it cemented it. The Federal Reserve Act passed 2 days before Christmas in 1913, when most of Congress was already on holiday or eager to go home. Woodrow Wilson signed it into law. At that moment, the debt trap mutated. It became infinite. Before the Fed, a government could only borrow as much gold as banks actually held. There was a physical limit. The Federal Reserve removed that limit. Here is the mechanism that Morgan's group designed, the mechanism that is still running today. The U.S. government needs money. It doesn't have it. Does it tax you? No, that's politically unpopular. Instead, it issues a treasury bond, an IOU. The Federal Reserve buys that IOU. But where does the Fed get the money? It creates it out of thin air. It types numbers into a computer. The government gets the cash to spend on wars, programs, subsidies. The Fed gets the bond, and the taxpayer gets the bill for the interest. This closed the loop. The government effectively gained a credit card with no limit, provided by a bank that could print the money to pay the bill. This created a perfect symbiotic parasite. The politicians get unlimited spending power to buy votes. The bankers get a guaranteed stream of interest payments forever, paid by your labor. Morgan died in 1913, the same year his masterpiece was born. He didn't live to see the monster grow, but his legacy is the $38 trillion debt. Without the Federal Reserve standing ready to buy government debt, the U.S. government could never borrow at this scale. The market would have said, "Stop," decades ago. But the Fed never says stop. It just prints. By the 1970s, the trap that Patterson, Rothschild, and Morgan built was functioning globally. The industrialized world was hooked on debt. But the developing world, the poorer nations, were about to be brought into the fold in a much more brutal way. The system had a flaw. Sometimes borrowers simply couldn't pay. Inflation was soaring. The dollar was losing trust. The machinery was overheating. It needed a new operator, a man who would install the final lock on the prison door, the man who would teach the world that bankruptcy is not an escape route, but a torture chamber. Enter the fourth architect, Paul Volcker. If Patterson created the engine, Rothschild the gears, and Morgan the fuel, Volcker built the walls that prevent you from ever leaving the building. By 1979, the global financial system was shaking. Inflation in the United States was over 10%. The value of the dollar was rotting in people's pockets. Foreign governments were losing faith. The entire house of cards, built on the promise that paper money had value, was threatening to collapse. Volcker, the newly appointed chairman of the Federal Reserve, faced a brutal choice. He could let inflation run and destroy the dollar, or he could save the currency by destroying the economy. He chose the latter. In October 1979, Volcker did the unthinkable. He raised interest rates to the sky. The federal funds rate shot from 11% to 20%. It was a monetary nuclear strike. In America, businesses closed, unemployment spiked, and farmers drove their tractors to Washington in protest. But Volcker stood firm. He crushed inflation. He saved the dollar. But in doing so, he triggered a silent catastrophe halfway across the world, one that would finalize the debt trap for the rest of humanity. During the 1970s, when interest rates were low, American banks had flooded the developing world with cheap loans. Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, they borrowed billions to build roads, power plants, and cities. They borrowed in dollars. But these loans had a catch: variable interest rates. When Volcker jacked up rates to 20% in Washington, the interest payments for Mexico City tripled overnight. It was a bait and switch on a continental scale. Mexico owed $80 billion. Brazil owed $60 billion. Suddenly, the interest payments alone were larger than their entire national income from exports. They were drowning. In August 1982, Mexico's finance minister flew to Washington and dropped a bombshell. "We have run out of money. We cannot pay." This was the moment the system should have cleared. In a free market, if you lend money to a borrower who can't pay, you take the loss. That is the risk of capitalism. If Mexico defaulted, the biggest banks in America, Citibank, Bank of America, Chase Manhattan, would have been technically insolvent. Their capital would have been wiped out. The Wall Street empires would have fallen. Volcker and the U.S. Treasury could have let the market work. They could have let the banks fail for their reckless lending. But they didn't. Instead, they orchestrated the Volcker innovation, the bailout disguised as a loan. They brought in the International Monetary Fund, IMF. The IMF gave emergency loans to Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina. But here is the sleight of hand. Mexico never saw that money. The IMF wired billions to Mexico, and Mexico immediately wired it back to Citibank and Chase to pay the interest. The banks got their money. The U.S. financial system stayed whole. And Mexico didn't get debt relief. They got more debt. They now owed the original amount to the banks, plus new money to the IMF. This established the modern paradigm of structural adjustment. In exchange for these loans to keep the interest flowing, the IMF demanded control. They forced these nations to cut spending on healthcare and education, to sell off state-owned assets, water, electricity, oil, to foreign corporations for pennies on the dollar, and to devalue their currencies. They stripped these nations of their economic sovereignty. This is the Volcker legacy. When debt becomes unpayable, you don't forgive it. You restructure it. You lend the addict money to buy the drug from you. It turned debt into a tool of geopolitical conquest. A country that owes you money it can never repay is a country that must do whatever you say. This pattern has been rinsed and repeated for 40 years. Latin America in the 1980s, Asian tigers in 1997, Greece in 2010, Sri Lanka in 2022. Every time the narrative is the same, we are helping you. Every time the result is the same. The creditors get paid, the people suffer austerity, and the debt burden grows larger. Volcker died in 2019, hailed as a hero who saved the dollar. But for the global South, he was the jailer. He ensured that the interest would flow eternally upward, from the poor of the world to the banking centers of the North. Now step back and look at the machine in its entirety. The four architects didn't know each other. They lived centuries apart. But they each built a specific component of the trap we are all living in today. Patterson, 1694, invented the concept of permanent debt. The government borrows and never repays principal. Rothschild, 1815, created the global web. Debt is tradable, so default is systemic suicide. Morgan, 1913, built the infinite checkbook. The central bank creates money to buy the debt, ensuring no limit to borrowing. Volcker, 1982, designed the inescapable cage. When you fail, you are refinanced into deeper submission. The result is the world of 2025. 315 trillion in debt. Government debt, corporate debt, household debt. None of it will ever be repaid. All of it pays interest. And this brings us to the final, terrifying question. If the debt is never repaid, why does the system continue? Because the debt is the money. In our modern system, money comes into existence only when debt is created. If the U.S. government paid off its $38 trillion debt tomorrow, every dollar in circulation would vanish. The money supply would shrink to zero. We would have no currency to trade with. We are trapped in a paradox, where we must go deeper into debt just to keep the economy functioning. We must borrow from the future to pay for the present. But who are the winners? Who sits at the top of this waterfall drinking from the stream of interest payments? It's not the government. The government is just the collection agency. It's not the rich in the generic sense. It is the institutional asset managers. Today, the debt is held by giants like BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, and Fidelity. They manage tens of trillions of dollars. They buy the government bonds with your money, your pension fund, your 401k, your insurance premiums. The government taxes you. It sends that tax money to bondholders as interest. The bondholders, the asset managers, take a cut for management fees. They use the remaining capital to buy up real assets, houses, land, technology, companies. It is the largest wealth transfer in human history. It is continuous. It is structural, and it is invisible because it isn't called theft. It's called monetary policy. You work. You pay taxes. The taxes pay interest on a debt that was created out of thin air. And the recipients of that interest use it to buy the world out from under you. So, does this end? Can we break the cycle? Or are we destined to service this debt until the heat death of the universe? The history books tell us that every debt system eventually breaks. But the way it breaks, that is what you need to prepare for, because we are getting very close to the mathematical limit. We are now arriving at the mathematical limit. For the first time in history, the United States government is spending more on interest payments than it spends on its own defense. In 2024, interest on the debt crossed the $1 trillion mark. That is $1 trillion leaving the real economy, leaving schools, roads, hospitals, and vanishing into the black box of the bond market just to service the legacy of the past. This is the Minsky moment, the point where the borrower must borrow just to pay the interest. It is a terminal diagnosis for any normal entity. But for the architects, it is the harvest. Look at the timeline. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes with terrifying precision. In 1929, the system reset through liquidation. The Great Depression wiped out the debts, but it also wiped out the people. It transferred real assets, farmland, factories, from the bankrupt middle class to the banks that survived. In 2008, the system reset through consolidation. The crisis destroyed the small banks, and the giants, J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, grew larger, absorbing the wreckage with government guarantees. Now, as we look toward 2025 and beyond, we are facing the third act. The debt is too big to be paid and too big to be bailed out. So, what happens next? The architects have one final move left. It is the only way to solve a debt that cannot be paid. You inflate it away. This is the harsh truth they won't say in press conferences. The only way for the United States and the world to pay off $315 trillion is to make money worth less. If you double the supply of money, the real value of the debt is cut in half. It is a soft default. They don't tell you they aren't paying. They just pay you back in currency that buys half as much bread, half as much gas, and half as much house. Inflation is not an accident of supply chains or wars. In a debt-based system, inflation is the feature. It is the tax that nobody voted for, levying a fee on your savings to bail out their leverage. Patterson made the debt permanent. Rothschild made it systemic. Morgan made it infinite. Volcker made it inescapable. And today, the system is working exactly as they intended. The $38 trillion isn't a crisis for the people holding the bonds. It is their asset. It is their steady stream of income. It is the collateral that underpins their power. They have built a reality where nations are merely tenants on their own land, paying rent to a financial superstructure that produces nothing but liquidity. So why does this matter to you? Why should you care about men who died centuries ago? Because once you understand the mechanism, you stop waiting for a politician to fix the economy. You realize that the economy isn't broken, it is rigged, and you cannot win a rigged game by playing by the rules of the people who rigged it. You stop saving in a currency designed to depreciate. You stop trusting a system designed to extract. You start looking for assets that they cannot print. You start building independence from the debt trap. The four architects built a cage, but they left the door unlocked for those who can see the bars. They teach you in school that debt is a burden, but the architects knew better. Debt is a weapon, and interest is the rent we pay to live in their world. If this changed how you see the money in your pocket, if you finally understand that the global debt clock isn't a scoreboard, but a timer, then you are ready for what comes next. Subscribe. Because in the next episode, we aren't just looking at the history of the trap. We're going to talk about the escape route. This is Economy Rewind. Watch the money, ignore the noise.